These tulip flowers are really fun because they require us to combine several different, basic stitches, but some fun things and some different colors. So to make just a really interesting flower. And I call them tulips. They're not really tulips. They're like a fantasy tulip, I guess. But that's just what I'm calling them to differentiate them from the other flowers. And the first thing we're going to do on these is to work on these petals down here at the bottom. And we are going to fill each of these in with needle painting, similar to what we did on the viola. But whereas on the viola we used like two different shades of pink, on this one we're going to use three each on each of these petals. We're going to use three completely different colors, but we're still going to blend them in the same way. And I know I spoke a little bit about needle painting in rows, and rows is a little bit misleading because rows sort of imply rigid straight lines, and that's not what we're doing. But if you wanted to sort of generally mark out where the different colors are going to be ahead of time, you can certainly do that, and it does sort of look like rows. So on each of these petals, we're going to have a section here across the top that's one color, and then a middle section, and then a section towards the bottom. Now, these lines are not going to show, so it doesn't really matter what you draw them with. I just used the Frixion pen, and I made them slightly curved. But just like with the viola, I'm going to start at the top and then work different lengths of stitches into the next section, and then I'll do the same thing with that section, and then I'll fill in the last section. And here I am working towards me, so I'm going to start up here and bring the thread this way towards me, and I am again using one strand of the DMC thread. So for each of these petals, and similar to the viola again, it's a little bit of it's a subtle arc, not quite as curved as the arc on the viola. So these lines are going to end up being a little bit more parallel and not so much, one line here and one, not such quite a drastic angle for each stitch. But let me show you what I'm talking about. And we are not putting in an outline stitch around here like we did on the viola. We outlined the edge and then stitched over that. We're not doing that here because I'm going to put a decorative outline on top of this stitching. So I can just start right in with my one strand, but I am doing the same thing. I'm going to lay in stitches of various lengths across to help me gauge the angle, even though it's a more subtle angle. But all my angle will come straight towards this point right here, all my angles, roughly. I'm starting out with this real pretty, deep, kind of bright orange. So those are my first stitches, and now, same as before, I will stitch back and forth, different lengths, until I have completely filled up this section. And we're working with smaller sections here than the viola petals, so this won't take long at all for each little color that we're doing, each section. I'm starting on the petal that is the bottom center, and then I'll do the two side petals, and then I will do the back petal. Doesn't really matter which one you do first. I could have done one of the side petals first, but I just like to come up in fabric like this when I'm starting out here on fabric that's not stitched. So, I mean, if I had already stitched like this left side petal, for instance, I would have stitching all the way up to this edge, and I would be coming up right next to it, and that really doesn't matter. It's not a problem. It's not hard. It's not going to mess anything up if you do that. I just like starting here. You start on whichever petal you want to start on. So I will go get this section as I did before, make sure that it's really completely full. There's not going to be any gray fabric showing through. And I'm really bringing those stitches down into that second section that's going to be the next color. I'm almost covering it up completely. And because the outside edge is not going to, it's going to be covered up with another outline, I'm being careful that it's, pretty accurate, but it does not have to be perfect. You can see my stitches up here are a little jagged. That's fine. Totally going to be covered up, so don't stress about that. So let me go fill this in completely so I don't have any thin spots, and we will come back and do the next color. I finished stitching the first section, and it doesn't look wonderfully perfect because, as I said, I did not spend just huge amounts of time making sure that this outside edge was perfectly perfect like I did on the violas, because I knew that outside edge was going to show. So it's kind of ragged up here, but like I said, don't worry about that because we're going to cover that up. But now it's time to do the second color. So I am again using one strand. This time I'm going to use the dark pink, dark coral, but the same thing, come up way, and I've almost, in fact, I'll show you, I've almost completely covered up that whole second area, that whole second row, because I really made sure that I took those yellow stitches way down deep into that section. But now I'm going to come up inside the stitches I've already made, bring that pink up and come down, and now I'm going to cross over the whole middle section and come down into the third section. And this is where thread painting can be really fun. It's really neat to do like a dark, like the light purple and the dark purple, or the light pink and a darker pink next to each other, and see that real subtle blending of those two colors. But it's also really fun to experiment with using two completely different colors. So whereas this is a different color, obviously it's pink, not orange or yellow, but it is similar in shade. It's not like a super dark pink next to a super bright yellow. Anyway, it's a fun blending of color when these two colors get on here together. And the angles are a little bit more drastic, obviously, because we're coming down to more of a point here. But all the same stuff still applies. Make sure the lengths of your stitches are different, so you don't have a bunch of stitches that all come up or go down in the same exact place, in a line. You can still use that trick about, that was kind of hard for me to figure out whether to go down on this side of that thread or that side, so I'm going to pull that one down. Looks like it needs to go on that side. And just like the first section where I wanted to make sure that I had filled in enough, I do want to make sure that, especially like right in here, it looks, full enough up here because I've got two layers of thread. Down here it looks sparse because I only have the pink. So I want to make sure that right in here is got good coverage. Because if I don't have enough, enough pink when I bring the next color in, those colors aren't going to blend very well because there's not a whole lot of pink there. Now I can see that area where the pink and the bright yellow blend together, and it's so pretty. See right in here, all up in here, how pretty that looks where those two colors are mixed together. So I think I'm getting close. Feel like I have a space right in there. Let me come way up in here. Let me pull that thread down. Yep, that's where it's right where it needed to be. All right, I think I'm done with that. So now let me go get the last color for this petal. Next up is doing the same thing, but with one strand of this really bright green. I love this color of green. And at first it's going to look like it's just not blending because it's so different from the pink, but it will. Just do the same thing. Come up inside the pink that you've already stitched and bring it down to that point. And I think this again will help you see why really working with one strand, even though it may feel like it's tedious at first, is really almost easier when you're thread painting because of that one strand. When you bring a thread, even of a kind of a way different color, when you bring it down and do it like that, it really blends, especially if you kind of run your fingernail over it, how it really lays down inside that other color, the color that you're stitching into, and just blends really well together. So this is a much smaller area, so it's not going to take as long. But you do want to make sure you get enough thread in there. It's kind of all coming down to that point. Maybe one more over here. One more. Okay, there. All right. Now, see how fun that is? Those really bright colors and the green into that pink. I just think that's so fun. Okay, now what you want to do is you want to stitch all of these other petals before we move on to the next thing. So as I said, I would stitch this one, the two on the side, doesn't matter which one first, and then I would do this back one last. Same colors for each petal. I mentioned earlier that we're going to be adding a decorative outline on top of this, but before we can do that, we need to stitch the top edge of this flower first because I want that decorative outline that we're going to be doing to be on top of the stitches that we're going to do on this end. So that's why we're working on this part next before we do that. And to do the first part for the top edge here, I'm going to be using 3 strands of the dark blue of DMC, and we're going to be using the buttonhole stitch. And I might inadvertently call it the blanket stitch somewhere along here, so don't be confused if I do, because they're very similar, and there's sort of like this big controversy. I don't know about buttonhole versus blanket. I think technically blanket stitch is done if you were doing it, say, like on the edge of, it was as an edging, you know, where you've got one fabric and then you're going around to the back side. And then buttonhole is when it's flat on the surface. But whatever, it's the buttonhole stitch, and I always have to think for a minute about how to start it. And I'm going to start on this side, and I'm going to work around here. I've turned this flower that way. Normally I would work with it straight up like that, but again, the clamp on my hoop stand is kind of in the way up there because it's so close to the edge. So I've just sort of turned it at an angle. And so I'm going to start that stitch, this bar of this stitch right here. I'm going to do that I'm going to do that at the end, actually. No, actually, I'm going to do it first. In fact, I think I didn't trace that quite right. I want it to be a little bit more there instead of, I cut that line in too close, too far in. All right, so anyway, I'm just going to make a straight stitch from here to there. And then now that's just going to close that off. And now I'm going to start my buttonhole stitch. So I'm going to come right up where I started that other stitch. All right, and then I'm going to hold this to the side, and this is going to be similar. It's essentially the same stitch that we did on the edge of the leaf of the viola, you know, where we made that little scalloped edge. But those buttonhole stitches were stitched into another stitch, obviously, and stitched very tight and close together. This is going to be flat on the fabric. So anyway, just let me show you how it works. So you still want to keep that thread over to the left. I'm going to skip over. I'm going to come down here to the bottom of this stitch and go down. But when I come up, now I'm going to come up at the top of that line, and I'm coming up inside this loop so that when I pull this, it's going to create a little bar across there, and that pulls that across. So let me do that again. So I've come up here. I'm going to keep that thread to the left. I'm going to jump down here. I'm going to go down right there. I'm not going to pull the thread all the way. I'm going to come up. I'm going to get that loop out of the way. I'm going to come up at the top of that stitch, that bar, come up inside the loop. And if you'll notice, when I'm pulling it, I'm not pulling the thread straight up. I'm pulling it out here to the left and pretty flat against the fabric. And I'm going to pull it until that, I mean, if I pulled it this way, you can see what happens. It doesn't work. Let me loosen that up a little bit. So you want to pull it until this section of the stitch, I'm going to pull it that way a little bit. This section of the stitch gets in line and you have sort of a 90, or not sort of, you have a 90-degree angle right there. So same thing. I've come up. I'm going to go down there. Don't pull the thread all the way. Come up at the top of that stitch and pull this until that stitch is tight. Keep a loop with my thread. Go down. Come up inside the loop and pull that stitch tight. So that's simple. It does take so many times I have started that stitch and I've gone the wrong direction. I have to really think about how to start it. Once I get going, I remember what I'm doing, but it does take a little bit of thought. It's a simple stitch, but I always have to think for a minute about how to start it. All right, now we're on the last stitch. Go down. Come up. And see, for this one, we like down here I had to make like a separate stitch to close that off. This one, that's already done. So you see that? So see how that's finished off right there? So now that that stitch is in the right place, to finish it off, all I have to do is just take the needle down, going, you know, over that thread to lock it in place. And there you go. Next thing is to fill in between each of those sections, with 2 strands of really simple satin stitch. This is super quick, not complicated, just straight stitches right next to each other inside each of those sections. I think will fill in there. All right, so do that for each of those areas. Now we can come back and do the decorative outline on top of these petals. And what we're going to do for that is we're going to couch yarn with one strand of DMC thread. But before we can couch that yarn, we're not going to use it just the way it comes, just like this. We need to separate it actually. And I love this yarn, super bright pink, but it is a little bit, it requires a little bit of a delicate hand. You can't treat it too roughly, especially with what we're going to do. We're going to separate the strands, but you know how I always preach for the DMC thread when you are separating strands to pull one strand out and strip it and pull it out that way? You cannot do that with this yarn. It'll just go all to fuzzy. So you have to, well, first of all, I have cut off, we're going to work with short pieces. So I've cut off a piece that's about 6 inches long. And now I can separate the strands. It's made up of 3, sections. And you can just pull it apart with your fingers, but sometimes it's easier. I get another needle and I use the eye, so I'm not using the point, and I kind of separate it like that, pull it apart. And so I very gently, I find where it naturally wants to separate, and I very gently will pull it apart like this. And it is going to twist up on itself, but just gently pull it back apart until it lays out like that. It's going to be kinky, curly like that, but that's okay. You can go ahead and do that for the other two because we're going to use those two. Slowly pull it apart. Let it pop back. It'll sort of snap back and straighten it out. And so now I have 3 strands that look like that. So from here on out, we're going to do everything we can to minimize pulling this yarn through the fabric, because if I were to keep pulling it through the fabric, it just gets fuzzy, it falls apart, it just goes to fuzz, all the fuzz gets on the outside and it doesn't hold up very well. So that's why we're couching it, first of all, so you're not pulling the yarn through the fabric over and over like you would if you were stitching with it. So with couching, you really only have to take it through the fabric at the beginning and at the end of your line. So to do that, okay, here's my needle, and I need to get this yarn on the needle. And because it's so, fuzzy again at the end, I am going to use a needle threader. And I have one of these, really inexpensive ones. And this is another thing that you have to be pretty delicate with, because where that wire is attached, if you pull too hard, that you can just pull that wire right out of there. So to use this needle threader, I'm going to put the wire into the eye of the needle, and then I can take my yarn and carefully make sure that I capture all of those fuzzy strands of yarn. And I'm just going to take it a little ways down, and now I can hold the needle, and here's the part where if you just yank that needle threader through there, you're going to put a lot of strain on that wire. So I always grab it. I don't hold it back here on the handle. I pinch the wires up here where they're attached to that needle threader. So now I can carefully give it, sometimes you kind of have to flatten out your yarn and then just very gently pull it through. So I'm only going to pull it until I can get the yarn through the eye of the needle like that. So now I'm going to work on this last petal, and I will say that it probably doesn't really matter, but I did this back center petal first. So I just went from here to here. Then I did this left one from here around to here, and this one from here around to here. And I only did that because I kind of wanted this couching to go on top of where that one went in, but again, it's one of those things that it's not really going to matter. So anyway, now I have my yarn on my needle, and I'm not going to treat this like I would a thread. Normally, once I don't have a knot or anything in it, it's just my 6-inch piece of yarn that I've separated. And normally I would, put a knot in the end and then I would put the needle through and I'd pull the thread all the way through. Not going to do that with this. I am going to go down where I want to start. So I'm going to start down here, work around, and then finish in the same place. So I am going to put the needle down, and what you can do, and also to sort of help you, is put the needle down where you want to start, and you can kind of push the fibers of the fabric apart a little bit, kind of ream out a little hole if you want to. And then I'm going to pull the needle down, but I'm not going to pull very far. I'm really only going to pull about as far as until I pull that little tail through. So now I have my yarn here ready to go, but I didn't have to pull this length of yarn all the way through the fabric. It has not even been pulled through the fabric yet. So that helps preserve all of those fibers and sort of keeps them smooth. So before I can go ahead with couching, I need to secure that tail on the back. So let me flip this over and I'll show you what I'm doing about that. And here is my very chaotic back. Okay, but here's the little tail that I just pulled through. And since I have already been couching some, I already have the one strand of thread that I've been couching the other pieces of yarn with. But if this is the first piece that you're starting, just get your one strand. This is the light green DMC. Get one strand on your needle and you can just tie a knot in it, and you can do this very same thing. But I am going to, instead of trying to tie a knot in this or try to thread it on a needle and run a needle, I'm just going to use this one strand of thread to, secure this tail onto the stitching. So even though I'm up here with this green thread, it doesn't matter. I'm going to hop down here and I'm just going to stitch. I'm going to just stitch down that pink yarn. I'm just going to make several stitches on top of it, so that I have I don't know, a half inch or so of that yarn that's been sewn down. Sorry, sometimes it's, okay, there we go. Let me do one more stitch with it headed this way. Sometimes I'll even change directions of that pink yarn and go this way, just so that it won't get pulled out. But it's really not going to get pulled out anyway. It's not like the back of this is going to get any kind of wear on it or anything. But anyway, that just kind of secures it. I might do one more. Whoops. Ooh, hard not to get that needle caught in all the other stitching. I might run that under that loop a couple of times and make kind of a little knot that way and pull it. And now I can trim off the pink yarn. Do not trim the green because you're about to use that thread. So now that's trimmed off, and now I can flip it over and we can start couching. And here we are back on the nice neat front, and here's my yarn that I secured to the back. And so now I can pull on this a little bit, and because I secured it on the back, it won't come out of the fabric. But don't tug on this too hard, or run your fingers down it a whole lot, because like I said, it'll get all fuzzy, and we're trying to minimize that fuzz. But I can pull on it now. So now I'm just going to do a regular couching stitch, go around that petal, and this yarn, you really do have to baby it. But I originally I had intentions to use this yarn a lot more places on this pattern, but it's the areas, like every flower and each little section, is just kind of small, and this yarn is sort of thick, and I just couldn't figure out a way to use it without having to separate it. But I was determined to use it because the color is just so fantastic. It's such a neat fluorescent hot pink, So that's why there's just a little bit of it on here, and you do have to baby it a little bit. But I gotta tell you, that pink's worth it. One more couching stitch. All right, so leave that green thread hanging on the back. And so now we kind of have to do the same thing we did at the beginning with a needle to get this thread back to the back of the fabric. So same thing, I'm going to use my needle threader, put this end of the yarn in, sort of pinch it together so I get all of it. All right. Pinch the wire of the needle threader and pull it through till it pops through. Okay, now I can take this needle with the yarn and go down right where I started on the back. Sometimes you kind of have to get that green, that couching thread, whatever thread you're using. You have to sort of hold it out of the way. All right, so now I've taken that needle down, and now I'm just going to pull that a little bit. I'm going to very gently pull it through to the back, slowly pull that yarn until it's on the back. And now on the back I can do the very same thing I did at the beginning. I will take this couching thread and I will just sew down the tail end of that pink yarn on the back, you know, wind it around just a little bit so it's really secure. Once it's secure, then you can knot this green thread, and then you can trim off both the yarn and the green thread. And there you go. That is how to use very delicate but brightly colored pink yarn for couching these petals. On the straight lines at the top of the tulip here, you could just sew straight stitches and be done and call it a day, and that'd be great. But let's make it more interesting. How about let's use the dreaded bullion stitch. Oh, I know, but really it's a really cool dimensional effect right here, and we are going to use that lovely pearl variegated DMC pearl thread that has the pretty aqua and then the bright green in it. So it's kind of a double deliciousness of the pearl thread with this shiny twist and the variegated color. But it also makes these bullion stitches a little bit easier. So if you remember back to when we were doing the viola, there's a long tutorial, a bullion stitch tutorial in there. It's also going to be a separate tutorial, complete video tutorial on its own, but it's the same exact information on my YouTube channel. So if you either didn't get a chance to watch that one then, or if it's been a while and you might want to go back and watch it again as a refresher, I would highly recommend watching that information again. So, but when we did the violas, we used DMC stranded thread, and it is trickier to get a bullion stitch to work well with the DMC stranded. It works, but it just takes a little more patience. This pearl thread is a little bit easier. It holds together and it doesn't want to separate on you quite as much, and it's just, plus it has a really neat shiny effect. So as we do on a bullion stitch, we are using the milliner's needle as always, because it makes it so much easier. If you'll remember, the milliner's needle is one where the eye is the same width as the shaft of the needle. It's really long, so it gives you a lot of needle to work with. All right. And come up at the top of your stitch, and these are just going to be straight flat stitches. You don't have to curve them or anything. So I have this turned a little bit again because of the way it has the clamp on my hoop stand, so that's why it's kind of facing that way. But anyway, that's the top of my stitch. Go down at the bottom. Leave yourself a bunch of working thread, so don't pull it all the way through. Then bring your needle back up right where the thread comes out of the fabric, but don't pull the needle all the way through. Take this working thread, and I've determined that it takes 6 wraps to make the length of this stitch. And this thread, I really like the way it looks when I wrap it counterclockwise. So I know I'm kind of like this right now, but so I'm counterclockwise is going to be this way. So 6 wraps. 1, 2, oh wait, no. Sorry, that's clockwise. Other way. Mixing me up, having the stitch facing the other way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can push those wraps down. It's a little hard. I can't really bend my needle across because the edge of the hoop right here. So that's why if you had never done this length of stitch before, I mean, I can tell you that it takes 6 wraps. But if you're working on a stitch that you don't, you can't do that, definitely get your practice hoop out with your fabric stretched in it. Draw this same pattern quickly so that you can determine exactly how many wraps. But I know it takes 6. So I'm going to pull that thread through, pull it down, use the tip of my needle, pull this thread that way, pull it snug, and put that needle down right at the bottom of the stitch. Okay, see how pretty that pearl thread looks? And I love that when that aqua shows up on that color. So let's do that on that thread. So let's do that again. Come up at the top of the stitch, hold that working thread out, go down at the bottom of the stitch. All right, leave myself a lot of thread, come up at the top. I'm going to go counterclockwise, 6 wraps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Slide those wraps down so they're up against each other. Hold the thread gently, pull the thread through, pull it towards the bottom of the stitch. Use this end of my needle to, while I'm pulling at the same time, and kind of push those stitches up a little bit. Pull that a little bit more. And go down. All right, let's do that again. Come up, go down, hold working thread out, come up where the thread comes out of the fabric, counterclockwise, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Push the wraps down, hold the wraps, pull the thread through, and pull that thread, push up with the end of the needle, and go down. And one other trick, when you are doing repeated stitches like this, just one right after another, this is one of those stitches where it really benefits you to let the needle hang and untwist, because something about all that in and out and in and out and all those all that wrapping, it really gets the thread twisted up, and it just makes it harder to deal with when it's all twisting up on itself. So let me do one more for you. Up the top, down at the bottom. Come out where the thread comes out of the fabric. Counterclockwise, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Push those wraps down. Pull the thread through. Pull on it while I'm pushing up with the needle. Be a little bit more. And take the needle down at the bottom of the stitch. All right, so that shows you how fun this variegated thread is. This one's aqua, this one's kind of a greeny aqua, that one's like kind of a yellowy, browny green, that one's a bright green. Just one of the many reasons I love using variegated thread, because you don't have to do any work to get all those colors in there. So just finish up those 2 bullion stitches, and that is the top part of the tulip finished. I lied. That was not the last thing to do for the flower. We need to add the pink beads. Totally do not want to forget these beads. When I am sewing these beads on, I want to put them, you can sew a bead on so that it sits on its side with the side of the bead showing, or you can sew it on so that it's flat and the hole, the center of the bead is showing is up. And that's how I want to do these. So to get those on there, I'm going to bring my needle up right at the top of that bullion stitch, And right in the center, I'm using one strand of thread, get a bead on your needle, and get it in place. You want to go ahead and get it where it's going to be. And then make one stitch straight across on the side, right next to the bead. Pull that thread down, and you want that bead. Now it's going to want to flip up on its side like that, but just get it to lay flat. And now we need to put one more stitch to keep it flat. And trust me, I tried. Do not try coming up in the center of the bead. It takes forever and it's super tedious. Just don't even try that. So get that bead to lay down on its side, and now bring the needle up on the opposite side right next to the bead. That's why you need it to be laying down, so you know what exactly is next to the bead. Get as close as you can get it without coming up underneath the bead. And now go down in the center, and that will hold that bead flat. So just do that for all of these beads. Put 2 little stitches, one on one side going that direction and one on the other side going that direction, to keep the beads laying flat on their flat sides, so the hole is showing up. First thing to do for the stem and the leaves is to stitch the stem with the darkest green with 3 strands and the split back stitch. Done that before, that's not a big deal. For the leaves, we are going to put a bullion stitch inside of a chain stitch. And you could absolutely, if you didn't want to mess with the bullion stitches again, especially since we're going to be using the DMC, you could just put a straight stitch inside. That'd be fine. Just get a little bit of color in there. Or you could put, a smaller daisy stitch. I said chain stitch earlier. You could put a smaller, it's going to be a chain stitch. I'm sorry, a daisy stitch. You could put a small daisy stitch inside of a larger daisy stitch. But what I'm doing here is I'm putting bullion stitches inside. So I've done those 2. I'm working on this one. This is the lightest blue. This is the medium blue. This one's going to be the darker blue, not the navy blue, but the medium dark blue, whatever. Anyway, so I have my, same as always, my milliner's needle. I have 3 strands of DMC thread, and I'm coming up at the top, and I have determined that it takes 5 wraps to fill the inside of this shape. And when I come down, I don't want to come down right next to the stem, because I need a little bit of room to put the tip of the daisy stitch. So I'm going to come just inside that shape right there at the tip. So that's where I'm going to go down. Come up, and since I like the DMC to show the twists, the wraps, I'm going to go clockwise. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I bend it over, I can see that that's going to fill that shape just right. And the good news on these bullion stitches, if they are not, exquisitely perfect, each and every one, that's okay, because, they're going to be slightly covered up with the stitch that we're going to put around the outside. So don't stress too much about these, but it is a good chance to just practice some more of your bullion stitches. And you can see right here that these leaves are squished up against this box. When I originally did this pattern, they were too close. I've changed that now, so that's why it might look a little bit different on your pattern. As I mentioned before, we're going to put a daisy stitch around the outside edge of these bullion stitches. And I called it a chain stitch before. It's the same stitch. A daisy stitch is sometimes referred to as a detached chain stitch, but usually I try to call it a daisy stitch. So anyway, I'm using 3 strands of DMC, and just like the plain old good old daisy stitch, come up the bottom, go back down the same place, hold that loop open, pull that through there a little bit more, hold that loop open, and come up at the top of your stitch, right there at the top of the bullion stitch. And here's where you have to be a little bit careful. You can't, regular daisy stitch, you can just pull on it pretty tightly and you'll get a nice, you'll get a thinner, a skinnier daisy stitch. But I want these threads to sit on the outside of this bullion stitch. So I'm going to sort of keep my finger right there on top and just pull it slowly so that it doesn't jump up on top of that bullion stitch. It's so that these threads on the side stay on the side. So if you don't want to pull it too hard because you want it to stay kind of rounded. But then anchor that stitch at the top, and there you go. You will do the daisy stitch on the top leaf, the top two leaves, with the bright green fabric, bright green thread, the middle leaves with the medium green thread, and the bottom two leaves with the dark green thread. And I know it's a lot of changing of needles and threads, but I really like the effect. I mean, it's worth it to me to have this variation of color from light, medium to dark.